is now my pleasure to introduce Julie McKay. Previously working as the Executive Director for UN Women Australia for close to a decade, Julie McKay has worked tirelessly to advance gender equality and women's empowerment globally. She has previously served as the Gender Advisor for the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, where she supported the Cultural Change Program within ADF. Julie runs a private consulting business where she has worked with an array of companies, including PwC, Autopia, and the Queensland Public Service, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Aurizon. Currently convening the Queensland Male Champions of Change, Julie has spent over a decade leading Queensland-based CEOs to advance gender equality in typically male-dominated fields. She is also chair of the Women's College Council of the University of Sydney, as well as previously holding numerous board positions in the not-for-profit sector. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you very much for that welcome, Chantal. And I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And thank you, Auntie Gillery, for your opening and for your welcome. I could hear a pin drop in the room, and I suspect you've given a lot of us things that we need to think about in terms of how we continue to learn, to hear and to face into what equality for First Nations Australians and First Nations women really means and looks like. So thank you. Thank you for having me up to Gladstone today. Both Gladstone and engineering hold a special part of my heart. Having been someone whose dad spent the vast majority of my childhood commuting up here, leading QCL's expansion project, and spending many school holidays doing terminal tourism, as my dad used to call it, because apparently that's fun, and growing up in a household where bulk handling review was a common source of conversation and news. So I feel really connected to the community, even though it's been a little while since I spent time here. But it's an enormous privilege to be with you for International Women's Day and to hear even just some of the stories of the incredible women in your community who are seeking to advance gender equality. One of the things I would like to say at the outset today is that I do think this year, more than any other year, we all need to take it on ourselves to make sure that we are leaning in to advancing gender equality. Because if I'm honest, normally International Women's Day and International Women's Week is the most exciting week of my year. I love the events, the sharing of stories, the celebration of women's achievements, the sharing and the recognition of all that we've achieved. This year, if I'm totally honest, I feel depleted. I feel like the stories that are emerging in our parliament, in our workplaces, are completely overwhelming. They're stories that should never have happened, but they should not be happening in the workplaces in 2021. And in some respects, I suspect many of you share that sense of frustration with the slow pace of change, and it's evident in the turnout to today's event. It's a pretty incredible moment in Gladstone to see literally hundreds of people hit pause, to come together, to learn, to challenge, and to be inspired. So thank you for coming. Normally I would give a speech that talked about the amazing women in the local community, talked about progress, talked about the celebrations that we rightly deserve to have on this day. Today I thought I would actually just share my frustrations, in the hope that that makes me feel better. In the hope that I can pass some of that frustration to you. But most importantly, in the hope that we can together recommit ourselves for the need to advance gender equality in 2021. 100 years ago, this Friday, March 12, the first woman was elected to an Australian Parliament. Her name was Edith Cowan, and she was elected to the Legislative Assembly of Western Australia. I can't help feeling that we've let her down. In her opening speech, she didn't speak about families or children or women. She spoke about fiscal management. She spoke about water, about agriculture, about meat. She gave her perspectives on the issues of the day, and she did that courageously as the first woman to ever enter an Australian Parliament. She demonstrated in that speech what we know today, which is the value of women's voices, the value of their perspectives is important, not just on issues that someone else deems to be women's issues, but on all issues. Edith said in that first speech 100 years ago, "I feel sure that the greatest kindness and tolerance will be displayed by men towards women and by women towards men in this and all future parliaments." Oh, Edith, if you could see us now. Fundamentally, gender equality is an equation of women's access to leadership opportunities, women's economic empowerment, and women's ability to live free from violence and discrimination. If countries, if communities can make progress on those three areas, they undoubtedly make progress towards achieving gender equality. But the reality is that there is no country in the world that has achieved gender equality. So we don't have a roadmap that we can follow the steps for. What we're doing is actually leading and groundbreaking, but it's also incredibly frustrating because new generations of women continue to face the challenges that 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago we identified as being unfair, as being not in the national interest, as being issues that were fundamentally about power imbalance and privilege. But we haven't actually shifted them. We're talking more about them, and I think that's important, but shifting them is different. When we think about the underrepresentation of women in leadership, we often think about women in parliament. Around the world, only 25% of parliamentary roles are held by women. Australia celebrates the fact we're doing much better than that, sitting at a whopping 30%. Just 1 in the 25 CEOs that were appointed last year was a female. So you can't tell me that we're making progress, because in 2020 we had 25 opportunities to recognise the incredible skills of women, and we did it once. Australian companies still only have 17.1% female CEOs and 14% board chairs. And those are numbers that were approximately the same when I started out my career in this sector back in 2007. And I started with a level of arrogance and naivety. I remember thinking, oh gosh, this can't be that hard. Gender equality, it makes complete sense. Of course, it's the right thing to do. I grew up with a vaguely equal experience through school and through university, and I definitely went to one of those great schools that tells me that nothing should be different for men and women can do anything. And I arrogantly thought that it must just be a failure of the women's movement, of the women's advocacy sector, of business leaders to just make the case properly. And now I realise actually it's incredibly complex and difficult, and we should be celebrating and thanking the women's movement for the courage that they've held for generations in trying to push this issue forward, because it's exhausting and because the change is so incrementally slow. Even in professions like healthcare, globally, where women make up 70% of the employees, they only hold 30% of leadership roles. And is that because they're just bad leaders? Like, is that actually what we need to say as a community? Women are just poor at leadership. Or is there something else going wrong in the system? In the ASX big companies in Australia, there are more Johns than there are women. There are more Peters than there are women. There are more Davids than there are women. The thing that our ASX CEOs, top 200, are most likely to have in common is not their educational background, it's not their career path, it's the fact that they are white and over 6 foot. Tell me that that makes a good leader, or tell me that our system's got something wrong. We've got any Johns, Peters or Davids in the chat? Hands up. Any brave Johns, Peters, Davids? You are more likely to be a CEO than any of the women in this room. So that's good for you, exciting for you. Less exciting for the women in this room. The issue when it comes to women's leadership is fundamentally one of culture and of merit. We pride ourselves as a country of being a meritocracy. We often hear in organisations, calm down, Julie, we're not appointing women for the sake of appointing women, we're appointing the best person. I don't want to be a quota or a target. I don't want people to believe that I only got this job because I'm a woman. No bloke spends time worrying that they only got the job because they're a bloke, but statistically that's what happens. We've got to change the narrative. Merit is some combination of past performance and future potential that we measure every single time we think about an opportunity, a promotion, a gateway. And when we think about that equation of past performance and future potential, let's unpack it a bit. If in this room we wanted to line up in order of who had the most experience to be, let's say, the gender advisor to the Chief of Defence, relatively objectively, we could get in a line based on a set of criteria about who had the most past experience that would directly relate to that role. We couldn't understand people's access to opportunity. So what we couldn't understand is the fact that by virtue of being a white woman who went to a private girls' school, I have had more opportunities than a young Aboriginal woman who didn't get a private education. By virtue of my parents encouraging me to do debating, meaning that I was a confident public speaker, I have had more opportunities than someone who chose to do something else at school that wasn't debating. We can't hold even for opportunity, but we can relatively objectively get in a line to say who has the most past experience. But then we start to measure potential. And there we introduce an entirely subjective measure. Who I think has potential, who you think has potential, and who all the blokes who hold the CEO roles in this country think have potential are all very different people. And so into our equation, every time we hire someone, we promote someone, we consider someone for the next opportunity, we introduce a subjective measure. And in subjectivity, what happens is our biases hold very true. I am more likely to appoint someone who is just like me. A CEO who is male is more likely to appoint someone just like them. And I had this moment in my career early when I started at UN Women where this became really clear to me. I had a board member come in for a bit of a check on how Julie was going, running the small team. I was 23 at the time. And at the end of the day, she said, and she meant it absolutely positively, "Wow, Julie, you built something pretty incredible here. It's like Julie and the Julies and everyone's firing and excited and you're going." And I went home that night and I was pretty chuffed. Well, that's a pretty good review from a board member. I wonder what she means by Julie and the Julies. Not only had I hired people that looked like me, I had hired people who acted like me, who thought like me, and who never disagreed with me, and it was amazing. But even someone whose career is in this space had unconsciously done the thing that we all do in that subjective measure of who has potential and seen myself over and over again. And in doing that, I didn't have anyone in the team who would see risk differently to me. I didn't see anyone in the team who could reach different groups of donors to the ones I could already reach to fundraise for our cause. I didn't see anyone in that room who could activate the community in any different way to how I could. And in those decisions, I'd fundamentally let myself and the board of that organisation down. And it actually took, and to this day I have a post-it note on my computer that says choose the other candidate. It took me working through each individual recruitment decision to work out what had I done wrong. And what it was every time was once I got down to 2 or 3 candidates, let's be honest, when you're at that point anyone can do the job and you're trying to find a reason. And the reason we often default to is who do I feel most comfortable with? Who do I think I'd like to work with? But the bias underneath that feeling is who's most like me. And so choose the other candidate for me has become that moment of going, whoever you have the gut feel about, that's because you're comfortable, pick the other candidate because they'll be better in your team. Now, it will be a different experience or a different interruption that works for you. But my point here is we can't spend another 100 years wondering why we've still got the leadership stats that we've got. We need to make change, not just at the CEO levels. They're almost irrelevant because there's so few positions. But in the everyday, who do we bring in as apprentices? Who do we think about for promotion? Who do we think about for key opportunities that will be career defining? How do we make sure every time we interrupt the dominant bias that exists because of the way our society operates, because of the history of this country, because of the way that we have all been educated to see the world? And unless we consciously interrupt it, we will find ourselves still here a long, long time from now. We also face persistent economic inequality. Women take home around 14% less than men every year. And the gender pay gap is something that is widely discussed, and then we have a pretty much she'll be right attitude to it. Because that statistic has been the same, plus or minus 2%, for 20 years. We are not making progress on closing the gender pay gap. We are doing more to observe it. More companies than ever before are reviewing their gender pay gaps. Most of them are doing nothing with those reviews, and that's data from our regulator, from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. We can see that more companies are saying, yes, we do pay equity audits. What action did you take? None. We need to close that gap between action and evidence. There is absolutely some issues around industry bias here, because we have male-dominated industries that are higher paid than female-dominated industries that contribute to the gender pay gap. We also have the leadership gap that contributes to the gender pay gap. But the point here is, if we consistently pay women less, we value them less. They find it harder in families to negotiate their own careers, because it starts to just make sense that they're the one that takes time out because they earn less. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for who takes on unpaid care responsibilities, who has the secondary career, ultimately, who lives in poverty in retirement. Studies show that women are less comfortable negotiating pay. And a lot of our leaders say, well, it's up to them, got to just coach women to advocate better for themselves. But the reality is there's structural things that we can do in this space as well. Stop asking women what they were earning in their previous job, because chances are they were underpaid in that job too. Start being transparent about the pay bracket that your organisation allocates to a particular role, and within that bracket have a conversation about somebody's expectations. These are really little steps, but they can be game-changing in terms of closing the pay gap. In Australia at the moment, we don't consistently measure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment. So we say it's important. We say it's an important component of closing the gap, ensuring that our First Nations Australians have access to employment, but we don't measure it. Our ABS sends a message every single time we send out employment data that is, it's not that important. It's not important enough for us to actually measure and be accountable to progress. If we are going to close the gender pay gap, if we are going to genuinely provide women's economic empowerment in this country, we need to start measuring employment and we need to start tracking progress. If we look at all of the programs that have rolled out in the last 12 months that have been about job creation and about job security, there is a huge risk that the jobs we create are given to men, that the education opportunities, the traineeship opportunities end up with men. Stark issues exist where we have got significant government funding for traineeships that cannot be accessed if the traineeship is part-time. And yet we know that a significant number of women want or need to work part-time. Little steps that organisations can take to start to challenge these issues, to start to say, actually, for us as an employer, we're not only going to offer full-time traineeships, we're going to find a way to offer part-time or flexible traineeships. We're going to look every time that we create a role, that we access a government subsidy, that we think about a new part of our business that needs more people, about ensuring that we over-represent on the populations that are currently underrepresented in our organisation. For as long as we don't have economic security for women, it's going to be incredibly hard to achieve gender equality. Sexual harassment and violence against women. We talked about one of the key tenets of achieving gender equality being that women are able to live a life free from violence and discrimination. And yet in this country, 1 woman a week loses their life at the hands of a partner or a former partner. 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men will experience workplace sexual harassment. And the complexity of shame, embarrassment, power imbalances and fear is very, very complicated, difficult to understand, let alone legislate or develop workplace policies around. But the reality is we still live in a world which worries far more about the career of a promising athlete or the life of a good bloke than we do about the impact of these issues on women. Many people in this room will have experienced workplace sexual harassment. Some may have experienced domestic violence. All of us are bystanders to these issues. In recent weeks, we have seen enormous courage. We've seen an Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, speak about her experiences of child sexual assault. We've seen Brittany Higgins come forward and make a complaint of sexual assault in our parliament, the very workplace that is meant to set a standard for us all. But you only have to spend 15 minutes reading media comments or social media comments to see the resistance, the anger and the fear that exists in our community. She probably led him on. A comment about a 15-year-old anorexic child who was the experience of sexual abuse. Why didn't she report it? What was she wearing? She was wasted. She didn't even call the police. Frequent comments about Brittany Higgins' allegations. Why didn't she just leave? The most commonly asked question of every victim of domestic and family violence. The likely path for somebody who reports workplace sexual assault or workplace sexual harassment is that their career in that organisation will end. They will leave and they will hopefully find alternative employment, hopefully. The likely path for someone who is a respondent in a sexual harassment or sexual assault claim is that there will be no consequences. They will remain in role and their career will continue. The most dangerous time for a woman who experiences domestic violence is the weeks and months after they leave. It's a pretty good reason not to leave. And we're all bystanders to this, and it sits deeply uncomfortably. I remember early in my career, I was giving a speech at one of the federal government departments, and the secretary, in briefing me into the event, said, Julie, it's fantastic you're here. We're really supportive of gender equality. International Women's Day is a big event for us. Can you just not touch on sexual harassment and domestic violence because it's a lunch and it makes people uncomfortable? I gave a 40-minute presentation on sexual harassment and domestic violence and I never got invited back, but I felt very proud that day. It makes us all uncomfortable because we know that we're bystanders. We've seen it, we've heard the jokes, we've overlooked the risk factors because it's hard to know how to intervene, to know what the right thing to do is. I sat in Brizzy Airport yesterday waiting for the flight. The guy next to me was having an increasingly aggressive conversation on the phone, using words like, you're a moron, this is it, when I get home. And I sat there with all of the training that I've had, thinking, Julie, this is not your problem. The person is not here. It is not your role to get involved. You probably are at risk if you do get involved. Just leave it. And that's me, someone who works in this space as an advocate every single day. Eventually I leant over and said, excuse me, do you have the time? And he kind of looked at me. But in that moment, it forced him to look up, to respond, and I hope it made him realise that someone was watching what he was saying and doing, and maybe diffused the anger because for a second, that path of rising aggression paused. Asking people what the time is, directions, are some of the tools that you can have in your toolkit when you see something that is uncomfortable. In the street, in your workplace, on a phone call, in the community. Because it just disrupts, doesn't solve the problem, doesn't save the person who's at the other end of the experience, but it disrupts. In a workplace context, we've all heard the jokes and the comments. We've all been part of the, just keep away from him, he's a bit creepy. We've all seen someone belittled based on their diversity. It's very hard to be the person that consistently intervenes. It's exhausting, but it's far, far more difficult for the person who's experiencing the behaviour. And so if you did nothing else after today's event, I encourage you to think about how you can lean into some of those difficult conversations. How you can ask, what did you mean by that when you hear a sexist comment or a sexist joke? How you can actually say to someone, hey, listen, in that meeting, the comment that you made about X just didn't sit right with me. You don't have to publicly embarrass them or admonish them in the meeting, but following up, Can you help me understand what that comment meant, because it didn't sit comfortably for me? Can you understand that there was a conversation after that meeting about what you meant was, which in the future would be great for you to think about? People often don't intend to create the harm that they create. Calling them out, supporting them, providing an alternative way to engage can be game-changing. We have undoubtedly made progress, but at the current rate of change, gender equality is about 100 years away, so at least 3 generations, and that is based on averages. So when we think about First Nations women, women with disabilities, refugee and migrant women, LGBTI women, the stats are far, far further off. What gives me hope is that in a town dominated by industry, at an event hosted by the Gladstone Engineering Alliance, all of you showed up. You showed up to listen, to learn, to celebrate, but I also suspect that you showed up to be challenged and to reignite your commitment to gender equality. Shirley Chisholm, the first Black US Congresswoman, once said, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, then bring a folding chair." And friends, we need to crack out the folding chairs. Gender equality starts at home. Seeking to ensure that unpaid and paid care work are divided equally between men and women remains a challenge, but it's not impossible. And at every event where I make that comment, someone says, "Oh, my husband does far more of the cleaning and the childcare than I do." That is absolutely true for some people, but the majority experience is that unpaid care responsibilities still sit on the shoulders of women. Watching women's sport, challenging your local community organisations to have women on their boards, ensuring that the media you consume represents the society you want to be part of. We still have radio stations with all-male panels, TV shows with all-male panels. We have very few First Nations representatives in our media. You can affect change by making different choices about the media that you consume. And also not underestimating your power more broadly as a consumer. It was a small group of customers that led Westpac to become Australia's first green bank, and ultimately for the other retail banks to follow suit. Customer advocacy works. It was a small group of customers who ultimately forced Arnott's to commit that Tim Tams would be made from ethically sourced chocolate. Consumer advocacy works. Thinking about, big or small, the spends in your household, the decisions you make, and putting your support behind organisations and institutions that fundamentally prioritise women and diversity will make a difference. At work, asking questions, respectfully of course, but challenging your employers to go further is powerful. Expanding parental leave to include equal paid leave for men and women is game-changing. Calling on your employers to add paid superannuation to unpaid parental leave will close the gender pay gap significantly. Asking leaders to set targets for gender and other aspects of diversity, and then ensuring that they actually report against progress of those targets internally and ideally to the public will help progress. We wouldn't start the year without a budget. We wouldn't think about a site having no workplace health and safety plan. And yet too many organisations fundamentally miss the step of measuring and holding ourselves accountable for progress on gender equality. We need to spend more time together as individuals. There's no policy that an organisation can roll out that delivers gender equality. Fundamentally, it's about getting to know people as humans, understanding what supports them to succeed, helping them set up their lives, careers in a way that's meaningful, purposeful for them. But it's also about very consciously recognising that not everybody starts from the same place. And we all have a responsibility to lean in to the situations and individuals for whom that starting place is further back. Women, we need to stop having coffees. No more mentoring, no more chats. Everyone in this room needs to be a sponsor and needs to have a sponsor. And the key difference there is someone in your life who is actively looking for new opportunities for you, supporting you, encouraging you, challenging you, helping you decide when it's time to step forward, step back, helping you navigate the complexity that exists for all of us in our society. Sponsorship changes the game, coffees don't. And every one of us has a role to play in ensuring that our workplaces and communities are safer. We need to actively talk to young men about consent We need to have conscious conversations in our workplace about why talking about what a victim was wearing, talking about whether or not they were drunk, inherently puts responsibility back on the victim and doesn't shift responsibility to the perpetrator. We need to call out the low-level jokes and jibes and examples in our organisation, which we all have, that fundamentally perpetuate a culture where violence and harassment are tolerated. We need to all take responsibility for knowing the signs of domestic and family violence and leaning in to support someone who we think might be at risk. Friends, we do have a lot of progress to celebrate. Choosing to focus there today would have been easier. But if you, like me, have found that the recent events in Parliament, in our workplaces that have been shared in the media have shaken your confidence in that progress, then it's time for us to step forward together. Every one of us has a story, has skills, and has power. Every one of us must choose to challenge. Thank you. Now we do have time for a couple of questions. We've got a mic coming around, or you can attempt to yell. In the spirit of dare to interrupt, I'm not going to let the room be silent. Who would like to ask the first question? It's one of the challenges. When you speak at all male events, there's about 40 hands up. Every time I speak at a majority female event, that's not the case. Thank you for bailing me out. There's a mic just behind you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hi, I would just like to know, so where do you recommend to go if you do want to get more educated on these issues?
It's a great question, thank you. So there's some fantastic free resources. Unfortunately, there is not a kind of central hub that I can recommend. The Workplace Gender Equality Agency, which is our regulator, has a really strong education arm, and so there's lots of stats and facts and disruption on their website that are just freely available and able to be downloaded. And they've also got some little toolkits, so if you've got a safety share or a morning meeting that you just need a kind of 10-minute exercise, there's some of those there, so that's Workplace Gender Equality Agency. There's an amazing organisation called CEO Challenge, which operates out of Brizzy but is nationwide now, who have really led the development of workplace responses to domestic violence. So they do a lot of the training in this space, informed by the women's movement and survivors. And so again, if you haven't heard of their work, that's a really good place to start. But I think it's also about the local community. It's talking to your local elders about their experiences and asking them for advice on what needs to change. It's talking to each other today. And so, you know, over lunch, what's your opportunity to commit in table groups? What are we going to find out more about? What are we going to make sure that we lean into? That can be really powerful. And then there's some really micro changes that you can make, and I'm trying to make them, which is to think about the things that you do in your life. So if you're a Netflix addict, thinking about moving your addiction to shows that are challenging you around equality, discrimination, watching some of the amazing documentaries that have been made about trailblazing women, about our history as a country and what that means for us today in terms of power and privilege. So there's some really good things you can do there. If you're a book reader, again, I can share some resources, but some amazing books about how the system fundamentally is broken and how you seek to change it. And that's everything from Annabel Crabb writing about the wife drought in this kind of humorous way to say we all need a wife, right through to, again, individual women's stories. So there's some really good resources there. Thank you. Other questions, comments, challenges? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. That was just really amazing and very relative to the day. You did mention at the start of your speech that you said that you didn't want to be part of a quota, and then towards the end, you talked about the fact that we need to challenge those norms. With respect to our parliament, we obviously see not enough women voices in our parliament. The way forward to trying to address these issues culturally within our own country is to get more women voices in parliament. We do see some political parties that have quotas and some that don't, and there's all sorts of challenges around whether or not that's the right way to go. In your view, are quotas the way forward to get more women voices in Parliament, and which will hopefully at some point, change the cultural issues that we have in society and help us address women's issues?
Thank you for asking that question. For anyone that knows me, that could be the best Dorothy Dixter in the world because it's my favourite topic, but we don't know each other, so thank you. When I said at the beginning that I didn't want to get a role because of a quota, that's the story that I hear in organisations. I am the world's biggest supporter of quotas. I'm equally on the record as a younger woman when I started out at UN Women saying that I didn't support quotas. So over the last 15 years, my perspective on this has changed. Why? Because I think I found out a bit more information and I got a bit less naive. There is no country in the world that has made progress on systemic gender equality without a legislated quota in their parliaments and in their listed businesses. There is no example anywhere in the world of a country that has done this and made progress without that legislation. So the fact that we still think maybe we'll be the first, maybe we will, very unlikely, I would have thought. Legislated quotas ensure that we consider the whole candidate pool. They put a minimum standard around what we want to see in Parliament, and I actually think we probably need to go a bit deeper than just women. I think we need, and obviously I would take advice and guidance from Aboriginal elders, but I think we need to think about quotas and representation there also. The reality is until you have a critical mass of voices, you can't change a system. Edith Cowan couldn't change a system on her own. What she could do was consistently bring a different perspective and consistently raise her voice. It's very hard to change a system. 30% women in our parliaments today still doesn't see us anywhere near a critical mass in our cabinets, in key decision-making rooms, in non-traditional decisions. And so if we want to spend another 50 years getting from 30% to 38%, 40%, we can do that, or we can face into the fact that all of the awareness raising, community education and talking hasn't got us there, and we just fix it. Because the reality is we all know that there are many, many, many qualified women in this country who could take their rightful place in our parliaments and succeed. This is not a question of capability. This is a question of access. It's a question of power. And so I think it's a choice ultimately between disruptive change and painful incremental change. Thank you. I think we're out of time for questions. Oh, we've got one more burning question. I'll let one more burning question and then we're going to break for lunch.
Thank you for that, Julie. I'm not sure whether it's burning or not. Glenn Churchill. Just two quick questions more than anything and a comment. And I'll make this comment up front to start with. I was mayor of the adjoining shire for many years, and my philosophy has been if you want the job to be done, you get the men to do it. If you want it done properly, you get the women to do it. Now, some people might, rejoice in that comment. The reality of it is proven that women, ladies, majority have a tendency to see broader issues on a wider scope than the mere tunnel vision of men. I wanted to comment on another, and I ask your opinion on this because my previous background was a police officer for many years, undercover and operational, and I saw the best and the worst of domestic violence and sexual violence. But without going into that, what I'm actually asking is, why is it that we see so often that we hear the name of the victim or those that have been affected by the aggravated assault, sexual assault, or whatever the case might be, but you never hear the name of the perpetrator until they're actually charged and or found guilty? So I ask you on that. The other one that Khan just asked is a segue, because I'm also president of the Retired Police Association. We have come a long way over the history of the police because it was always a man's club or the boys' club. But they do have a quota. They have a 50-50 quota on the recruitment of females and males in their ability to be able to work together to serve the community. It is a quota. Thank you. Would appreciate your opinion, Julie.
Thank you. So please start eating your lunch if you've got it served. And for those of you who are still waiting, it's coming. I can see it's coming out very quickly. Thank you for the question. I share your concerns around the efforts that we go to protect the perpetrators name and privacy. I think all parties to these issues deserve privacy through that process, whatever that process might be. But ultimately, I think we need to fundamentally change the way we actually report on these issues and the legislation around that, because otherwise we continue to be in the situation where the victim becomes the focus of media attention. Their every action, their every move, their every behaviour is questioned, challenged, commented on. The perpetrator is free from that to continue. Excuse me. With relation to the police, I think it is a question of capability. What we are seeing time and time again in the research is that all male teams and equally all female teams cannot see the full breadth of a challenge facing their customers, their stakeholders. They see risks differently. So the key here is not women taking over the world, men being locked out of every opportunity. The key here is about genuinely opening doors and creating opportunities for equality. Quotas in the police have led to significant progress, but there's no way that job is done. Women still have a very different experience in that workforce than men, and we still have to lean into, the numbers are one part of this puzzle, but the experience of inclusion, the everyday behaviours, the belief in whether or not your leader has your back, the belief in whether or not you will be treated equally and fairly, those are the measures that give us the best indication of whether we've really made progress, not add three women and stir and hope that ultimately delivers an outcome. Ladies and gentlemen, I will let you enjoy your lunch. We will be back shortly with our amazing panellists to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.